All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really complex geopolitical crisis in South Africa. We're talking about a situation that brought an entire nation's security apparatus to high alert. And the crazy part is, this was based entirely on a citizen-imposed deadline.
Seriously, the whole concept is wild to me. We're zeroing in on June 30, 2026, a single day that basically tested the limits of state control, civil society, and the rule of law itself.
Exactly. And it's such a critical case study because it shows what happens when unofficial groups try to force state action. The tension leading up to that date was palpable across the entire region.
Right, and it really forces you to ask some tough questions about authority.
Because that is the central question here. How does an arbitrary date, completely unrecognized by the actual government, trigger a massive security deployment, mass panic, and nationwide economic disruption?
It is a fascinating question. To really understand this, we have to objectively examine the origins, the execution, and the fallout of this anti-immigration mobilization. It didn't just happen in a vacuum.
No, it definitely didn't. There's a whole buildup that we need to unpack to see how a grassroots threat morphed into a national security event.
So to give you a full 360-degree view, we're going to follow a clear roadmap. We'll look at the initial June 30 ultimatum, then examine the state's massive security response.
Then we'll get into the human cost, the panic and mass repatriation, followed by the economic and transport disruptions.
And finally, we'll look at how civil society actually pushed back against the vigilantism.
Let's start with Section 1, the June 30 ultimatum. This was the catalyst of the entire crisis.
So where did this actual date even come from? Who was setting these deadlines?
Guest 1, the primary driver behind this movement was a civic organization called March in March. They were founded pretty recently in March 2024 by a woman named Jacinta Ngozi Zuma.
Okay, so a relatively new group making massive waves.
Exactly. They, along with other allied civic formations like Operation Dudula, focus heavily on illegal immigration policy, but they frame their actions as a direct response to very real, everyday frustrations, structural unemployment, high crime rates, and perceived issues with border management.
Right, they were tapping into genuine socioeconomic anxiety. And their central, non-negotiable demand was for undocumented foreign nationals to leave the country.
But this didn't just escalate out of nowhere, right? Let's look at the timeline.
Yeah, it was a steady build. In early 2025, they started by gatekeeping public hospitals in KwaZulu-Natal, literally demanding IDs before people could get medical care.
Wow. Just blocking access to healthcare?
Yes. Then by March 2026, things escalated with protests in the Eastern Cape over the coronation of a Nigerian king. In April, they marched on the Union buildings in Pretoria.
And that sequence of events culminated in them setting this hard nationwide deadline for undocumented migrants to leave by June 30, 2026.
Which created this incredible clash of perspectives. You had the protest organizers declaring June 30 a strict deadline for, quote-unquote, self-deportation.
Self-deportation. That phrasing alone is so intense.
It is. But on the flip side, you have the government, led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, explicitly pushing back. Officials were adamant that June 30 is just a normal working day.
And they had to clarify that immigration enforcement is strictly the constitutional responsibility of the state, not vigilante groups. They couldn't legitimize this parallel authority.
That brings us to Section 2, the state security response, bracing for impact.
Because even though the government said it was a normal day, they clearly knew it wasn't going to be, right?
Oh, they absolutely knew. I mean, how does a state respond to a highly publicized vigilante threat? They throw a massive amount of resources at it. Acting Police Minister Faraz Kachalia allocated an astonishing 600 million rand budget purely for operational readiness ahead of this date.
600 million rand. That just shows the level of anxiety at the state level. And honestly, it comes down to the ghosts of July 2021.
That's a great point. The 2021 unrest cost hundreds of lives and devastated the economy. The government was determined not to be caught off guard again.
So the preparation was overwhelming. In Catan alone, they deployed over 13,000 personnel. We are talking a highly visible show of force. Wait, didn't they also use a ton of surveillance tech? Oh, completely. Helicopters, drones, and they activated something like 33,000 CCTV cameras. The South African Police Service conducted multidisciplinary parades nationwide to show they were ready. But they had to walk a very fine line. Their strategy was to protect the constitutional right to lawful, peaceful protest while decisively stopping any criminal intimidation, looting, or violence.
Let's move to Section 3. Panic and mass repatriation, the human cost.
This is the part that is really hard to process, because despite all that heavy police presence and all the government reassurances,
The psychological impact of the deadline triggered an absolute humanitarian crisis on the ground.
The numbers are staggering. By June 25, which was still days before the actual deadline, over 15,000 Malawian nationals alone had been processed for deportation and repatriation nationwide.
Exactly. Over 15,000 people abandoning their entire lives. There were pop-up camps in Durban and Pietermaritzburg where thousands were just packed in, waiting to be bussed out.
And they were leaving everything behind. People were forced to liquidate whatever assets they had at a massive loss, just to escape what they thought was going to be guaranteed violence. Yeah, the sheer terror is perfectly captured by Thokozani Mampola. She's a 33-year-old mother who had been working at a small factory packaging groundnuts. She fled with basically nothing after witnessing violence in the streets, and she said, quote, "I said if I am going to die, let me die in my home country."
Wow. I mean, just imagine the level of fear it takes to make that kind of decision overnight. It is heartbreaking.
And a lot of that fear didn't just come from the streets. It came from the internet. Researchers were calling it the effect of angry algorithms. Social media was completely weaponized.
That is so true. Look at the case of Burundian refugee Jean Butoki. He was specifically targeted online. Vigilantes circulated his photo on social platforms demanding his deportation.
And people were sharing recycled videos of old protests, framing them as current events to stoke fear. It proves that digital disinformation has immediate, dangerous, real-world consequences.
That brings us to Section 4, Economic and Transport Disruptions, Targeted Infrastructure.
Right, because the fallout wasn't just humanitarian. The economic repercussions across key regions and supply chains were massive.
Security analysts had mapped out the major economic arteries as high-risk zones. In Gauteng, the N1 and N12 highways, plus the Johannesburg CBD, were flagged for severe disruption.
And down in KwaZulu-Natal, the N3 corridor near the Moy River was a huge concern. That is a vital route connecting the Port of Durban to the rest of the country. It was highly susceptible to truck blockades.
Same thing in the Western Cape around Mossel Bay and Kleinmond. These are critical logistics hubs facing higher risk levels.
So on the ground, what actually happened? Well, you saw foreign-owned businesses and local spaza shops preemptively closing their doors out of sheer fear.
And there were actual breaches. In Worcester, the police had to deploy tear gas to stop groups from looting a mall.
Meanwhile, in Pretoria, the authorized march completely gridlocked a central business district. It forced corporate supply chains across the country to activate really costly contingency plans just to keep goods moving. But there's another crucial layer to this story. Section 5. Civil society pushes back. The resistance to vigilantism.
I am so glad we are covering this because the xenophobic mobilization did not go unchallenged by the South African public.
It really didn't. There was a massive, multi-layered pushback. First, you had broad national coalitions, a group called Siafana Sonke, which represented 160 different organizations, publicly demanded that the government treat this as a humanitarian crisis.
Then you had the traditional leaders stepping in. Zulu King Misuzulu Caswell Lithini actively urged his regiments to ensure foreign nationals were not harmed and called for peaceful protests.
And my favorite part is the grassroots action. Local community committees in the townships were physically patrolling to protect their immigrant neighbors and foreign-owned businesses. That is real solidarity.
And they did that because they saw the broader danger. Sifwe Sigodi from the Thimble Hell Crisis Committee pointed out a critical flaw in the vigilante logic.
Yeah, he noted that when mobs take to the streets, they don't stop to check paperwork.
Exactly. These actions pose a blanket threat to all migrants, regardless of legal status, and honestly, even to South African citizens. It tears at the entire fabric of the community. Which leaves us with a really vital question to think about as we wrap this up. What does the normalization of vigilante deadlines mean for the future of democratic rule of law in South Africa?
If a non-state, citizen-imposed deadline can force a multi-million-dollar state security response, gridlock cities, and displace thousands based on fear alone, that is a massive challenge to state authority.
Absolutely. It's a geopolitical dynamic that goes way beyond just one date on a calendar.
It really is, and we will definitely need to keep a close eye on how this evolves.
For sure. Well, this has been an incredible breakdown. Thanks to everyone for joining the conversation.
Yeah, thank you all for listening to this explainer. Be sure to tune in for our next discussion. Take care, everyone.